Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Pedro Chavez. They invited me to give you guys a talk on understanding immigration policy over time. So we're going to be discussing the last 250 years of immigration policy in about 40 minutes. So yeah. So I'm going to be talking pretty quickly. If you guys think I'm talking too fast, let me know and I'll try to slow down. But let's get going. So this is what we're going to go over. You're going to learn a little bit about me really quickly, but after that, you're going to talk about immigration United States before we were the United States, after we were the United States, once we really started developing immigration law into our federal system, the different types of laws that we've had, the quota system, the family petition system that we have now, and we'll end with what's going on in immigration under the Trump administration. So this is me. I've been an immigration lawyer for about 6 years. I've been working in San Diego, Tijuana area for a while. Started as a staff attorney at Catholic Charities San Diego, where I was the only Spanish-speaking full-time staff attorney at one of the largest port of entries in the United States. So it was like, yeah, well, for a while. Eventually, I did hire some more. But I was the only one that spoke Spanish. I had a lot of cases, a lot of children cases. After Catholic Charities, I started my own nonprofit in Tijuana called Fear of Return, fearofreturn.org. We're a 501c3 that helps refugees find free lawyers. So we tried to help the shelters there. That's us doing some good work at the shelters in Tijuana. I've been asked to present like this before in other places and been interviewed by like TV stuff. Okay, so we're gonna talk first before the United States, so before we were a country. This is the population that we're looking at before we became a country. The first people that showed up were the Native Americans, 400 million people. That corresponds to the Western Hemisphere, like their entire population. 13 colonies, it was probably around 30,000 people that were living in the 13 colonies by the time we hit 1776. We have a lot of willing immigrants. Those are indentured servants or people that could afford the passage. Either way, they were willing in that they signed an indentured service contract to work for a certain period of time, and that's how they paid to come to the United States. We have slaves who came, as slaves. We all know the history of that. That ended in about 1807 for the Atlantic slave trade, but domestic continued. And transportees. Those were criminals in England who had the choice of being hanged or going to the New World, and they chose to come to the New World as indentured servants or transportees. So this is our target, this is our population. This is what we're working with when we become a country. Oh, and overall it's about 2.5 million people. That's how many people were in the original colonies. So before we were a country, every colony had its own immigration laws. Everybody kind of had their own kind of system for naturalization, which is the process of becoming a citizen. It wasn't the way that we think of citizenship now. It was more like informal, but it gave the people a right to be there. It also conferred eventually British citizenship if they were there for foreigners. England didn't like that, so that's why they passed the Plantation Act in 1740 to kind of unify all the colonies into one distinct naturalization process. Basically, if you're in one of the colonies, welcome, take a seat. If you're in the colony for about 7 years, you become a British citizen. So those were like hodgepodge immigration laws that every colony had for naturalization. Also, they had their own deportation, or they called it banishment proceedings. People that were poor, Catholics, they wouldn't be allowed into certain colonies, or they were excluded from certain colonies. So all the colonies, even then, were very exclusionary. A lot of deportations happened, but we called them banishments back then. Okay, so now we're a country, 1776. And as far as immigration goes, we only established one federal law for immigration, and that was for naturalization. We wanted, all the colonies had their own separate processes in how somebody becomes a citizen. Now that we were a country, we wanted one process for everybody, and that started with the Naturalization Act of 1790. You had to be a free white person of good character. That was the criteria. Free white person, good character. You have to be white. And you had to stay in the country for about 2 years, and or in one of the colonies. You had to go to a court and say, I want to be a citizen, and that was it. Then we went into the Alien and Sedition Act. Now remember, there's not really any immigration federal policy yet, or no immigration laws. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were meant to deport foreigners. John Adams was the president there. He was having a fight with the Federalists, or he was a Federalist having a fight with Thomas Jefferson's party. And so he was trying to stifle political speech. He was trying to allow him to deport foreigners. And he was also setting stricter naturalization laws. So it went from like 2 years to 5 years to 14 years that you had to be in the country in order to be a naturalized citizen. That reverted back after his administration. The only other time that we kind of saw like federal involvement in immigration was the Steerage Act in 1819, where we started regulating how many people would be on a boat. The reason for that was a lot of people were coming in, and we're not really sure why they decided to do this, but they did it under the Commerce Clause. They basically said that we have a right to control how people are coming in because it's a form of commerce. We want them to be a limit on how many people are on the boat, and that their conditions are certainly reasonable. By doing that, they increased the price of passage to come to the New World, and so maybe got better immigrants out of it. They also increased the price of leaving the New World to Canada, because that was a problem, and they wanted to populate the country as fast as possible. So that's one of maybe the reasons why they passed the Steerage Act. And then we also have the passenger cases, which is kind of similar. Okay. So we're a new country, open borders, but at the same time, all of these big events are happening. There's the first Opium War in 1839, Mexican-American War, the potato famine that brought a lot of Irish people over. My wife's probably relatives probably came that way. I'm almost sure of it. That's my wife over there. California gold rush was a pull factor. We needed people to mine here because you guys had gold. I'm from Texas. I had black gold, Texas tea. You guys had actual gold, still do. But we needed people to come and mine it, and also it brought a lot of Chinese immigrants, also for the Transcontinental Railroad. So a lot of people are coming, and something else happens around this time. The steamship is invented. So in the late 1930s, about 1939, steamship cut the transportation cost, cut transportation time, and transportation security. So what used to take 3 months now took a couple of weeks to cross the Atlantic. What was very expensive became cheaper, and the mortality rate was pretty high. It went down to about 1%. So during this period, we have the great migration of human beings over to the United States. And because of that, because of all of this migration, we start seeing the first bouts of anti-immigrant sentiment, because for the first time we start seeing competing for labor, we start seeing people complaining about a lot of people coming to the United States all at once. And so we have the Know Nothing Party that kind of gets established. They have a few political victories, but they don't last very long, maybe a few years. And then California Democratic Party here in California was very anti-Chinese, and they successfully lobbied Congress to start passing its very, very first immigration laws, which were exclusionary in nature. So prior to this, it was really just about naturalization processes. The federal government didn't really want to interfere with who could be here, who couldn't be here, who's going to be kicked out, who couldn't be. But there was a lot of lobbying that happened because of really severe anti-Chinese sentiment, and all of a sudden we have laws excluding the Chinese. At the same time that that's happening, the Civil War is happening, and we have this kind of weird act called the Act to Encourage Immigration. So during the Civil War, there's still need for workers, specifically in the North. Lincoln decides that he's going to pass this law. He does, and he's basically tried to encourage more immigrants to come in. So this is kind of a very strange thing, because while this is happening, there's all this other lobbying group coming in, basically trying to stop immigration. So once all of this has happened, the real question becomes, can the federal government control immigration? It's the first time that we start looking at what powers the Congress has, the president has to control immigration, other than just a naturalization. And these are the victories that we got. After the war, we got the 14th Amendment, which conferred birthright citizenship, due process clause that gave people due process, and we're going to see more about that in current times. But the key case I want you guys to know is Che Chan Ping versus United States, because that Supreme Court case gave the federal government what's called plenary power over immigration. So you can now have a free say on controlling immigration power. So there was no constitutional clause that says the federal government can control immigration. All it said was naturalization. But they used something called the sovereign, they called it a consequence of sovereignty in the case. And basically, any nation has the power to control immigration. The federal government is that nation, is that power, so they should have complete power over immigration, called plenary power. And ever since then, the federal government has dictated what happens in immigrants. They have basically free reign to decide who comes in, how they come in, and who is excluded as well. And because of that, you started seeing a bunch of things happening. We had the Chinese exclusion laws that continued. Ellis Island starts to open. We now have a border patrol. I think that was funded, in 1917 through the INA 1917. But you start seeing a lot of immigration laws being passed. We have a few other things are happening, repatriation, sending back Mexicans because we didn't like them. And this was during the Great Depression. We had World War II. That caused a panic because for the first time, we actually started seeing the first refugee crisis in World War II. We didn't want people here because they were competing for jobs during the Great Depression, and the Mexican Revolution was bringing people in. So we now have full power to control immigration under Xi Jinping, and we have all these events bringing more people in. And so what we start doing is passing, I guess, quota, well, actually refugees, but there you go. We start family employment base. This is actually out of order. Oh, sorry about that. So this PowerPoint is incomplete. Some slides are missing. Sorry about that. Okay, so basically, before we get to World War II, we start passing immigration laws that excluded certain nationalities. That was the Chinese Exclusion Act. In, let's see, 1917, we created a literacy test to challenge that. It also increased not just Chinese exclusion, but entire Asiatic exclusion. We eventually got rid of the gentleman's agreement with Japan, whereas they were excluding their own people from coming into the United States. We decided to exclude them all. And eventually, in 1921, we passed the Emergency Quota Act. So 1921, World War II just ended, and we're getting a lot of refugees. And we also get a lot of Southern and Eastern European settlers, mainly Italians and Polish and Russians. And so we have a lot of people that were not North and Western Europeans. So up until then, most of the immigrants came from the North, which is Ireland, Great Britain, and Germany. Those were like our main giant immigrant populations. We were okay with them. But then after World War II, or in the early stages of the 1900s, we started seeing a lot of Italians coming in, and we didn't like that. And so we passed a quota restriction based on the census that I think was in, I want to say 1870. No, 1890 census eventually, or 1910, then it became 1890 because we didn't like that. But we basically said, whatever the population was at this time, we're going to allow 3% of that population to come in. And because England had a large population, 3% of like 100 million is a lot of people. But Italians had very little, so that's how we based it. That 3% eventually turned to 2% in 1921 when you passed the INA 1924. Sorry, 1921 was the first Quota Act. We solidified it in 1924, and that's what we had for a good 40 years until 1965. We had a quota system that limited migration to 2% of the population at the census of about 1920, which meant that Italians were discriminated against, everyone was discriminated against, except for Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere was not affected by quota laws. They were completely exempt, so anybody that wanted to could come from Mexico into the United States. They were our primary labor. That eventually became an issue. People started noticing it, but when we first started passing the quota system, we didn't think of the Western Hemisphere. We only put these restrictions on Europeans because we were afraid of Southern and Eastern Europeans. Okay, so that brings us into the quota system, which should be in this slide somewhere, but I think we lost it. At the same time that that's happening, remember 1924, we have the INA, and then we hit World War II and refugees. So during World War I, there was a big refugee crisis because we had this war and people were moving from country to country because they didn't belong anywhere. It was a war-torn country. We didn't really respond to that. League of Nations was formed. We kind of had some refugee laws, but nothing really solidified it until World War II. After World War II, these two big events basically caused shame onto the United States. The first was the voyage of the St. Louis, where 937 Jewish individuals tried to land in the United States to seek basically asylum from Germany in 1939. We did not allow them in. They stopped at Cuba, and we refused 937 Jews fleeing the Holocaust. In the end, they were sent back first to Great Britain, where a few of them who had family there were allowed to disembark, and eventually they ended up in just regular Western European countries. And we estimate about 250 of them died indirectly in the Holocaust. So we found out about that after World War II, or during World War II. We knew about this happening because it was in the news. But then we were really ashamed of it once the Holocaust came out. We knew about the Holocaust, but after the war, we really, really knew about the Holocaust. And basically, we started feeling really bad about that. And all the other countries started to feel really bad about that. And so we started creating refugee protocols. United Nations were established in 1945. We created a presidential directive on displaced people, another one on displaced people. The big event was the Refugee Convention of 1951, which really established the refugee definition. But after that, we had 1967 Refugee Protocol that was adopted by most nations. We adopted it in 1980. But we started seeing real movement after World War II. to deal with refugees, how we define a refugee, who has a right to be inside the United States. Me in my practice, I deal a lot with refugees because I've been in the border and I see asylum seekers all the time. So we really started defining the refugee laws. And by 1980, the United States signed off onto the 1967 protocol and codified it in the Refugee Act. And now we have a definition of refugee, and the people that come to this country, they're afraid to return home, have a right to seek asylum in the United States. So that happened. Okay, so then we have the end of the quota system and the start of family and employment-based. So I want to talk briefly about the Bracero program before we get to this, which is 1965 law. Bracero program brought in a lot of migrant workers between 1942 and 1964. It was kind of like understood that you could come in, you could work for a period of time, and then you could leave. And there was like the seasonal migration, about 500,000 Mexicans coming in and leaving, coming in and leaving. A lot of reasons for the end of the program, but it all ended in 1964 and wasn't really reauthorized. But what was happening at that time is that there were already contracts and people living their lives in that system. So people were coming in, having their employer, let's say here in California, they know the employer. They know that if they come in, they have money for food and everything. And the borders aren't that secure. So once we got rid of the Bracero program, now all of a sudden we have this new status of illegal or undocumented immigrants who were coming in because they weren't protected in the Bracero program. Now, the Bracero program wasn't perfect. There was a lot of human rights abuses. Employers were abusing their workers, which is one of the main reasons that was sparking the end of the Bracero program. That, and it also happened around the time of the civil rights movement. So we were very, very, very into like what was going on with human lives, and it was very visible on TV. Bracero program was a shame in the way that they were being treated, the way that they were being exploited. But regardless of that, it did create a pathway to legally enter the country for work. And a lot of people were taking advantage of that or using that to provide for their families and to provide us with very necessary labor. After World War II, the people that were doing this, the American workers, didn't want to go back to that type of work. They had a lower population and they wanted industry jobs. They had just finished World War II. And now they wanted cushier jobs, and they could get them because there was a need for it. And they didn't want to do agricultural work anymore, which is one of the reasons we needed the Bracero program. And because we started in 1942, the war was still going on. We didn't have any labor. So it just kind of continued, and it was fine. But human rights abuses, public policy shifted, ended. Instead of fixing the Bracero program, it just ended. And then we ended up with the H-2A program, but that was very, very slow in coming, very, very slow numbers. And there was just this real need for workers. And it created what became undocumented or illegal statuses. All right, while that's happening in the INA 1965, we removed the quota system that had existed since 1924, and we were now just focused more on family-based immigration. We allocated about 20,000 visas per country, and we decided to exempt people that were immediate relatives of US citizens. So there are certain people that can come in very quickly as immediate relatives of US citizens. We switched to that family-based and also employment-based immigration. And over the course of the next years, we redeveloped that into different INAs. INA 1990, basically we just kind of updated the categories, updated the numbers, and just kind of kept going with this family-based system that we still have today, and employment-based system. While that's happening, in the 1970s, we have the deportation of John Lennon. That'll become important later. But John Lennon was in the country. He came in on a tourist visa, and he was also getting President Nixon very, very angry. So President Nixon was, excuse me, are you the keynote speaker? I'm sorry? Are you the keynote speaker? Yeah. Oh, yeah, I saw you from the picture. Oh. All right, nice to meet you. Okay, take a seat. Okay, so anyway, so John Lennon's being deported by Nixon because he was getting Nixon very, very angry during the 1970s. He was very politically active. And he had a really, really great lawyer who did a Freedom of Information Act request that found out that the US government for a very, very long period of time was deciding who could stay in the immigration process or who was not going to stay in the immigration process, who was going to be in deportation proceedings, who would be outside of those proceedings. And that was prosecutorial discretion. Once that came out, we started asking, well, if you're going to be using this thing called prosecutorial discretion, how are you going to use it? What is defining who is in deportation proceedings and who isn't? And that affected basically the development of DACA later on, because DACA is a form of prosecutorial discretion. It's deferred enforced departure with another name, but it's basically a promise that we're not going to deport you because we don't have the resources for it as long as you sign up for DACA. That happened during the deportation of John Lennon. Eventually, he just kept appealing until I think it was President Ford just annulled the deportation order. He got to stay. He got a green card. Yoko Ono also got a green card. So good news for them. All right, so now we're just going to go through a quick review of the presidencies up to getting to President Trump. So the Immigration Reform and Control Act passed in 1986. The big thing with that one was it created penalties for employers. So up until then, people were coming into the country outside of the Bracero program, and employers were being punished for employing undocumented workers. It created some kind of a system where they would get punished, but there was ways around it. Employees could use fake documents, and employers who were none the wiser, or employers could use subcontractors to get around them. So it's not really a big thing for employers. What it did do was eventually it did pass the amnesty. So a lot of undocumented immigrants in the country were allowed to ask for a green card, pay a penalty. And a lot of people did take advantage of that and become US citizens or legal permanent residents through the amnesty program in 1986. I have Fernando Valenzuela, just because he was there during this time that it was being considered. Some people credit him for amnesty, just because he went to the White House, and he's a very, very famous pitcher. And Nixon liked him. He actually was the one that actually requested Fernando to go to the White House. Anyway, then we have the Immigration Act of 1990. Not much happened there, except that a few more categories of immigrants were added, more funding for border security, and that kind of thing. And then we have the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, or IRIRA, of 1996. What that did, it created the 10-year and the 10-year, 3-year bars. If you're here in the country for more than 6 months without documents, you're subject to the 3-year bar. If you're here for longer than a year, subject to the 10-year bar. And that created what we now know is kind of like people come into the country and they stay here because, well, they stay here for a lot of reasons. One, we increased border security, so getting here is a lot more expensive. Where it used to be a couple $100, maybe $400 to maybe pay a coyote to get you around the physical barriers and get in. And also that's something that you only had to pay in once with new arrivals, because they knew how to get in after their first attempt in. Became a very, very expensive project, because along with this, Clinton started the first border fencing, which was about 70 miles. I think they called it the tortilla border or something like that. It wasn't very big. But once we really, really started expanding on fencing, specifically under the Bush administration with the Secure Fence Act of 2006, people had to pay much more expensive prices to get around these land borders. And for the first time, we started seeing people coming in through Arizona, which is a very dangerous crossing. People die out there because it's really, really hot. I've been to the Arizona, it is very, very hot. And so another thing is immigration was very limited into just California and Texas, and then immigrants started just coming into through Arizona, and they started adapting to different parts of the United States. But once they came in, they paid a lot of money. Let's say at the time it was a few thousand. My clients have been telling me that it's about 7,000 now. I've heard of a few clients that have said they paid 9,000 to a coyote to bring them in. I asked every client, just so I'm interested in the data. So I ask over time, what's the price now? And right now the highest I've seen was 9,000 to get people through. But you do need somebody to get you through. Where before, maybe one time you had to kind of navigate the system to get through. You need somebody to get you through that very, very dangerous desert, or to get you at least to an area where you can request asylum if you're an asylum seeker. So prices went up, so consequences of staying because of IRIRA went up, because now you're barred if you leave. And so more people started coming and staying. Whereas before, people were crossing and it was very seasonal. They could come here, work for a little bit, and then get kicked out or leave on their own and then come back the next season, even if it was undocumented. Now people were really having to stay because they're here for work. They're here to make money. And if they're paying $7,000 for a coyote, they have to work here for a very long time just to break even, and then to start sending money back home. And then the border crossing is dangerous because it's a desert now to cross. It's unsure if they'll ever come back in. So they just stay. And eventually they might be able to gather enough money to bring their families over. So that's what that did. So this is kind of the age of modern enforcement. Is what I just titled this section of immigration policy over time. We have the Homeland Security Act of 2002 created ICE, really solidified DHS into the subunits as we know them today, USCIS and everything. We have the Real ID Act and TVPRA, which created new things for asylum seekers more than anything. The Real ID Act changed the burden of proof on a lot of asylum cases. TVPRIA gave unaccompanied alien children who are under 18 and arrived in the United States alone the right to seek asylum in USCIS's asylum office and not an immigration court. So you can seek asylum in two offices. You can seek it at USCIS and you can seek it in an immigration court. Normally, if you're over 18 and you're not considered an unaccompanied alien child, then you would have to, if you crossed and were caught at the port of entry and they let you in, you'd have to seek it in an immigration court. Children have the right to go into the asylum office, which is not adversarial. There's no government attorney there trying to get you deported. You just present your case the best you can. I represented a few children through that process, and hopefully they get asylum there. But if they lose asylum there, then the case gets sent to the immigration court and they get another chance at asylum. The immigration judge will look at the case for the first time they submit it to USCIS, and you can submit more evidence the second time around. So it gives them a better shot at it. That's what the TVPRA did. There was a reauthorization act of what Clinton passed in the late 90s, which also created the TV visa process for human traffic victims. Okay, so then we get to the Obama administration. We called him the deporter-in-chief because he did deport a lot of people. But he started what was called Secure Communities Program, which was like this system where police officers were sending information to ICE through the FBI process. So somebody is booked into local police, they're fingerprinted, and that information is sent to the FBI. And under Secure Communities, DHS is also informed of that person being in custody at a local police station or a local prison. At that point, it's up to communities whether they want to respect the detainer request. ICE will send a retainer saying, okay, when this person's released from your custody, we would like to be there to pick them up. Please hold them for 48 hours so that we can pick them up and detain them again, this time not for their criminal violations, but detain them for their civil violations for being undocumented in the United States and begin deportation proceedings. Some states sign up for that and they respect detainer requests, some don't. But Obama started the Secure Community Initiative basically to give ICE more information so that when somebody is detained by local law enforcement, ICE knows about it. And that it led to a lot more deportations. That eventually became the Priority Enforcement Program, which is very, very similar to Secure Communities. It's the same sharing scheme. There were also some memos that were passed during the Obama administration dealing with prosecutorial discretion, that thing we discussed back with John Lennon that we discovered existed, which is the government's ability to deport or not deport depending on how much money they have. So those memos were very, very useful during the Obama administration and the Biden administration, not so much in the Trump administration because they were voided. But basically it says if they're not public security threat, serious criminal, then I can get them out on bond or some form of bond or parole if I need to. Or they're not going to be a priority for enforcement. And those memos, the Johnson memo and the Morton memo, were really, really instrumental in giving ICE attorneys the power to negotiate with me and other immigration lawyers on who's detained and who's released. He also passed DACA. I'm pretty sure you guys know that. He passed DACA. He tried to pass DAPA, which was for parents, but that didn't go through. But it's an executive order. Now that it's been implemented, it's pretty firmly in there. I've even heard that Trump likes DACA secretly, but it is what it is. I mean, Obama had his good moments, his bad moments. He did good with DACA, not so much with Secure Communities. The Morton memos were good. And he was one of the first presidents to start seeing this shift from migrant laborers crossing the United States to families crossing the United States. During the Obama presidency, we started seeing more families crossing, which led to the whole kids in cages thing and the families in cages, because honestly, the infrastructure of the United States wasn't set up to deal with families as much as it was to deal with single adult males. So, all right. And now we're at Trump. The first time he was president. I was an immigration lawyer when he was president. I started in like 2019. So I kind of got to see some of it. For me, when Trump was president, it was very normal. Like I just kind of thought that this is how it always is. But the other immigration lawyers who were like more experienced, they were like, no, Pedro, this is not normal. This is this is not how our lives were before Trump became president. But he did a lot of things. First, the Remain in Mexico program. So that's called the Migrant Protection Protocols. Originally, it was called Remain in Mexico. They just didn't like the name of it, especially Mexico didn't like it. And so they renamed it to the Migrant Protection Protocols. But under that, any asylum seeker that shows up in the United States and claims asylum at a port of entry will be given a court date, but left in the port of entry. Asylum cases can take a very, very long time. There's multiple hearings. Some of them can last for a year or more. And so everybody was made to wait in Tijuana. So some of my first cases were in the MPP docket. I was I was living in Tijuana at the time, working for Catholic Charities, taking on cases from Tijuana in the migrant shelter, signing them there, and then going to the immigration court hearings in San Diego. And so I would represent people there who were in the MPP docket. And the way it works is they're given a court date, but they're made to stay in Mexico. And then eventually, when the court date comes up, they go to the port of entry, they get picked up, they get handcuffed, they get placed into a car, they're driven to the immigration court where I meet them. And I defend them there in one of their master calendar hearings, eventually at their final hearing. And then they're sent back to Mexico, dropped off again, and told your court date is another 3 months. Have fun in Tijuana until the next one. And this happened in most of the ports of entry, basically in El Paso and Matamoros, also in Texas. I'm actually from Brownsville, so I get to say that I've seen those ports of entry also. So that was remained in Mexico. It lasted for a very long time, paused for a little bit, and then kept going. He also passed zero tolerance for a very short period of time. At first, it was a secret pilot program, and then it became a full policy to separate children from families until public outrage stopped it. There was audio recordings. There was a huge movement. People were very ashamed of at this moment in our history of a policy of separating families in order to create deterrence, because that's really what it was for. It was to deter families from coming. Families became a very, very large group of immigrants that were coming into the United States, and Trump went to a very large extreme in order to deter people from coming. He also did travel bans. First, it was majority Muslim countries. That's why we started calling them Muslim bans. And then he started adding other countries into it until eventually it passed. He kept trying to pass different iterations of it. Eventually, it did last, but they all ended under Biden when he became president. Okay, so this is what he did. At this point, I was almost done with the PowerPoint, and I just decided not to put any visuals anymore and just put things, because it was too much stuff that he did. So he expanded public charge. He increased public charge rules that you can. It used to be just cash benefits and cash benefits and long-term institutionalized care was categorized as a public charge. Then it became any use of public benefits for 12 months within 36 months. He less prosecutorial discretion, which I mentioned. During that time, it's very hard to negotiate with ICE attorneys on your cases, and that's true now. It really is. But under the Biden administration, I could email them and they would email me back. Now at this point, the email's gone. We get an automated email saying this email's not being checked anymore. Don't contact us here, because we did have private emails with ICE attorneys. No more prosecutorial discretion. They reduced asylum categories. The Attorney General started taking cases onto himself to reduce the type of people that could ask for asylum. Domestic violence victims couldn't ask for asylum anymore, really. There was worksite enforcement back then, and it's coming back now. Secured communities returned, so he was taking advantage of an Obama-era initiative, and it just kept it going. Title 42 expulsions, that happened during COVID. So Title 42, public health law, that allowed people that showed up at the port of entry to be sent back because of public health concerns. So because of COVID, they didn't have a right to seek asylum anymore. They were showing up and being sent back. I heard, I think last week, that he might be trying to bring Title 42 back just as a way to get rid of, but not under COVID. I think he was saying tuberculosis. But he's going to use public health laws to not allow asylum seekers to seek asylum. And effectively, he has ended asylum completely in the United States. He set court quotas. Every immigration judge had to close about 700 cases or face disciplinary action or being fired. So it created a lot of cases to go by really, really quickly, not a lot of time to collect evidence for asylum seekers who live in foreign countries. And so the court quota, 700 cases had to be closed per year. Friday releases, that's something that immigration lawyers started noticing, is that most of these announcements happen on Fridays. We kind of suspect that he did it to ruin our weekends. So that's, and it was a thing. He also built a 1,900, no, he didn't do that one yet. So he did not get to that. He really only just increased what was already contracted. So he did not create a giant border wall. All right, then we get the Biden administration. Okay, so he put an end to the travel bans pretty quickly. He did not remain in Mexico very, very fast. He tried to, but then courts kind of kept it going for a while, but eventually it did end. He returned to the old public charge rules, where it's just as long as you're not considered a public charge, as long as you just receive cash, if you don't receive cash benefits or institutionalized care. He returned to the old Morton Johnson memo, so we could start negotiating with ICE again to try to get some kind of discretion for our cases. Basically, whenever I negotiate with ICE, I outline what type of person that they're actually prosecuting. Like, this person is a community member. This person has letters from his religious leaders, from nonprofits, basically people that he's been helping throughout the time he's been in the United States. He has a family here, and sometimes that works, and sometimes that gets cases closed. Sometimes that gets continuance going. So that does work prosecutorial discretion, and it's a way for ICE attorneys who have a lot of cases on their own to start prioritizing more. Thanks, Bridge. I have 5 minutes left. To start prioritizing cases that actually matter. He started country-specific parole programs, so Venezuelans were able to come into the United States as long as they had a sponsor. I did a lot of those applications to get Venezuelan asylum seekers into the United States through parole. He created the CBP-1 app, which was good and bad in certain ways. It allowed asylum seekers a more orderly process to apply for asylum at the border, but the wait times were very, very long. So people that were waiting sometimes 6 months to just be heard on whether they have a credible fear in order to be led into the United States to continue their asylum case. And he also created Circumventing Lawful Pathways Asylum Bar. So if you didn't use the CBP-1 app, which is an application on your phone that no longer exists as of a few weeks ago, or a month ago, then if you didn't use that application to make an appointment to ask for asylum, then you were barred from asylum because you didn't go through the proper channels. But there were other ways around it. You could also ask for withholding of removal or protection against torture. Or you could say that there are exceptions to that, but it was a new kind of asylum bar that he created. We saw a lot of world crises under President Biden. The Ukraine war, I was in Tijuana when it happened. I saw a big long line. My nonprofit in Tijuana tried to help a few of them. The Venezuelan diaspora, he was president for that one, and also the Afghan withdrawal, which my nonprofit also helped out with. We represented about 68 Afghan Fulbright scholars because they were all studying here in the United States, and they were wondering like what happens because they have to go back after a certain period of time. Do we have to go back to the Taliban? So we started negotiating with, I forget, but one of the consulates, I think it was in Qatar, about their status because everything was moved out of Afghanistan to Qatar. So we were on a Zoom call with them trying to help them out. And then we have Trump 2.0. No. Maybe. Let's hope not. But all right. So he brought back everything I just mentioned that Biden kind of eliminated or created. The country-specific parole programs ended. There's no more parole for Venezuelans or Cubans or Haitians. CBP-1 ended. The application's been deleted as far as I can tell. There's no asylum processing at all. Also no refugee resettlement. Everything's been put on hold. Mandatory registration for regular entrants. That's something new. If you basically it only really affects people that entered and were never inspected or anything, and nobody knows that they exist. And then there's all these questions about, well, if they don't register, well, do they have to go through criminal proceedings in order to get the criminal charges for not having registered? So we're still looking for guidance on that because it's really brand new. Everything he's doing is really brand new. There's end of prosecutorial discretion, which I mentioned, negotiating new detention facilities. He's talking to El Salvador. He's reopening Guantanamo Bay. Basically, he needs more beds. He's running out of beds for detaining people. Lincoln-Riley Act was passed, attempt to end birthright citizenship. That failed pretty quickly, I think. Legal orientation programs that were suspended, I think those are back up. Still, I have a lot of friends that do legal orientation at the detention facilities. They provide free, because not everybody can afford a lawyer, and not everybody can get a nonprofit lawyer. And so I have a lot of friends that do these programs, and their funding was stopped for a while. I think it's back up, though. Expanded expedited removal under 2 years. So if you're here in the country less than 2 years without any authorization, you could be expeditedly removed very, very quickly in a day or two. So what I've been doing in my Know Your Rights presentations that I've been doing here in the Ventura County community is have proof that you've been here for longer than 2 years. If they're going to put you into proceedings, at the very least, make it long proceedings, not a quick expedited removal. Returning to worksite enforcement, we see that already. Mandatory detention for arrest for shoplifting. So yeah, it's just arrest, not a conviction, not anything. And so if you are placed in long proceedings, you might be subject to mandatory detention and be detained while your proceedings happen for 3 or 6 months. So you have to make the decision whether you're okay with that or hire a lawyer to maybe get you out through parole. Permitted in church, schools, and hospitals. I haven't seen too much of that, but he technically is now permitted in public areas in churches, public areas in school, and public areas in hospitals. Reception areas and parking lots are public, but if you have a sign that says employees only, they can't go into those areas without a search warrant, a judicial warrant signed by a judge, and most of them never have it. So what I've advised small businesses is put privacy notices everywhere. They can go into a reception area, but they can't go anywhere that says employees only. So put those signs up. He paused refugee resettlement. And there's a green card for people that have $5 million. I just heard about that one, so I don't know when that's going to come out, but I don't have any clients that could get it. So anyway, and that's it. Okay, so I don't know if we have any time for Q&A. It's 40. They told me 35, so we're past time. So you guys got to go. Thanks for everybody for coming.